think you should see. Can you? Okay, great. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Alexandrine and I, we were supposed to do two different presentations, but they're part of the same research project. So we decided that it made more sense to have one together. So it's going to be a little bit longer, but we're going to try not to be too boring. So I'm Eleonora. I'm a lecturer. I teach media studies at the Cabot University in Rome. Alexandrine, she's associate professor of audiovisual anthropology at the University of Victoria. So today we're going to talk about a project that we started a few years ago in 2017. And we're going to merge some of the questions we're working on together. So we're going to talk about Cuban cinema, visual technology, and nocturnal ethnography. So we've been working on a project of audiovisual nocturnal ethnography in Eastern Cuba since 2017. We started with a short film shot at night in Guantanamo. And today we are continuing our project. So today we would like to also open a little bit the future avenues of our project and have some feedback that's going to be very helpful for us. So I'm going to start with the title of our short film. The title was Guardians of the Night. Now, why did we choose this title? We actually made a reference to a social practice that came into being in Cuba after the revolution of 1959. So basically is the practice of La Guardia, which comes from, which was established by the revolutionary government as a sort of community-based local activity of watching after illicit things happening in neighborhoods, but also as to foster mass participation in the democratic process with decision-making spanning from health to security to ideology, and also to surveillance of anti-revolutionary practices. So on one side, there is this idea of surveillance. On the other side, there is this idea of democratic participation in the practice of La Guardia. Now, La Guardia, the CDR, the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, were basically a neighborhood-run activities in the territory of Cuba. And at night, there was a Guardia session. So there was a Guardia de Noche that would actually look after, watch out for things at night. As of today, the night watching sessions are rarely performed. However, a variety of Guardias have emerged, and we have encountered many of them while shooting our film. Oops, sorry, I just wanna move. Okay, so we wanna start from discussing a little bit how this practice moved into the imaginary of the night. So as of today in Cuba, you might encounter many guardias de noche. There are people literally looking after properties such as cars or actually watching, guarding markets, universities, theaters, schools, train stations. Another Guardia de Noche, which is very present in Cuban cinema, is the Guardian of Status. So we're gonna refer to that. Now you see here, we're gonna start with the movie by Fernando Perez, Sweet Havana, which was, it's a movie about the early 2000 everyday life in Havana. This is actually, there is a specific reference to a Guardia de Noche here, which is the person that you see here from the back. Basically, it's someone who is guarding the statue of John Lennon. Now, the Beatles were actually banned from the revolutionary government in the first years after the revolution because they were considered as the sin of capitalism, until actually Fidel Castro unveiled a statue of John Lennon and brought back the myth of the Beatles in Cuba. So today there is a statue of John Lennon in this park that has been renamed after him in the Vedado neighborhood in Havana. And they had to place a guard of this to watch out for the statue because basically people were taking out the glasses from the statue because of a question of scarcity in the country. So I just want to show you a clip where we see actually the night shift, where there are the two guardias that change their role at night. So as you see, here is another still from the movie where we have another Guardia di Noche in front of the statue of John Lennon. Now, Sweet Havana, we want to mention Sweet Havana because it was very influential for our own work. It's basically an atmospheric film where the sound takes a central role. It literally leads the visual. And it blurs the limit between the private and the public space and between different contexts. However, there is also a focus on night and side, as you see here from the camera movement on the lights, on the glasses of John Lennon, but also on actually the act of guarding. And now I want to bring the attention briefly to the etymology of La Guardia. La Guardia, from the verb guardar, means the act of watching in order to preserve things. So there is this idea of sight and safety at night. Another scene where we see other Guardia di Noche comes from the movie Chamaco from Juan Carlos Malberti. This movie from the early, it's around 2010. In here, actually, you see some of the protagonists from this is one of the initial scene of the movie. So the movie is about the chamaco, which means a guy. There is actually a guy that is murdered that you see here on the floor. The movie unfolds over multiple nights, with things happening only and exclusively during the dark hours. It is not about, it's about a murder, but we see the murder from the beginning of the movie. So it's not about the mysterious death, but it's actually a journey through the mysterious dark sides of the people who gravitate around this murder guy. And one of the main characters that we see at the beginning is the woman on the left, which actually is performing La Guardia di Noche. Here is what she says. She says, "I'm the park keeper. I look after the statue of the hero. It's well lit." She's actually watching the statues, but she's also the only witness of the murder. So she saw the murder, but at the same time, it's throughout the movie, it is as if she didn't see it. She's in a sort of state of numbness where she doesn't play the key role of the one who saw the murder and helped to solve the case. So here I want to show just a few clips about the many guardians that we encountered in our film. Here is a guardian of a bus station. Here is a guard at the school. And here is a guard at the train deposit. Okay, now I'm going to leave the mic to Alex.
Okay, hi everyone. Hi Eleonora, good to see you. It's 7 a.m. here, so happy to join you that early to start the day with very positive vibes. So the film Guardians of the Night that you can see, watch right now in the background was premiered on May 2018 in a cinema theater facing the Central Park of Guantanamo called the Jose Marti. And it was presented to a large audience composed of collaborators, friends, and people from the city. So showing our film's final cut in such a public event corresponded to the end result, if we want, of the production and post-production phases of producing or like creating Guardians of the Night. but also the beginning of a period during which we began to reflect mainly by the written form on the process of producing the film, a process we consider as being part of what we call a methodology or an approach called sensing the night, and which could be defined as an ethnographic, embodied, and audiovisual engagement with the night. So 6 months earlier, we went to Guantanamo in 2017, as mentioned by Eleonora, spending various nights wandering the streets of Guantanamo, recording sounds, listening, and also collecting images. So this nocturnal fieldwork led us to witness and experience a place that was totally different from a place we would have encountered during the day. And we, more specifically, we delved in the nocturnal hours of the city of Guantanamo with our camera for approximately 10 nights. Guantanamo is a city composed of approximately 200,000 inhabitants, and is part of the poorest urban areas of Cuba. It's located in the east, and it's very different from the naval base, the US naval base. So I often make that point because people think that we went on the military base, but the city of Guantanamo is actually a city that is located at 50 kilometers from that infamous base. So when we shot the film, we were accompanied by an electronic musician. His name is Zevil Strix, now living in Mexico, and a choreographer. His name is Joel Gonzalez Rodriguez, who's pretty famous in Cuba, but for the film, he was our producer. So we explored the night accompanied with them. And our intention was to, so we didn't have any plot or anything written, maybe not even that many expectations. Our idea was to wander and discover what was the night in Guantanamo, who were the people inhabiting darkness. And throughout the film process, we've met a few characters, participants in the film, what we came to call the guardians, sometimes in a metaphorical way. So people who work at nights, people who live at night, who inhabit the night in different ways. In anthropology, the discipline that I come from and I associate my work with, and also Eleonora in terms of this project, observation and participant observation are often the two key methodological approach. So that's what we learn at university, etc. But these methodologies assume a clear vision, and by extension, ethnographic fieldwork is an activity that is often expected to happen during the day, or it is just taken for granted. So darkness and reduced visibility challenge these traditional methods of conducting fieldwork. So building upon this fact, we decided to emphasize the oral dimension present in audiovisual ethnography. Our aim was to adopt an embodied, felt, and multisensorial awareness of the night, and see how it differed from our daily experience. So we aim at complexifying the universalizing idea of the preeminence of vision over the other senses, and also this Western-centered approach to knowledge based on vision. And as I just said, that is often influencing the way that the fieldwork is conducted. So to respond to this lack of vision, we awaken our ears, try to listen carefully to the soundscape of the night. We captured by our recording devices, and later also through the edition of the original soundtrack that was edited and crafted and created by Zevil Strix. So the sound of the night became our primary inspiration to explore the multiple encounters that we had with those guardians. So we engage with what we call a participant listening approach instead of participant observation. Through that approach, we argued that the night in Cuba enabled this shift from observational, so a more like traditional anthropological Western-centered way of knowing, to a more immersive, embodied listening methodology. So the night allowed us to develop a sensual and experimental approach to ethnography in which the process of filmmaking and sound recording became essentially our fieldwork experience. So of course, the experience of the night of conducting fieldwork at night was a challenging experience for us. We strolled the city from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m., feeling a shift in our sensory system, fatigue, but also a deep sense of the marginality that comes with nocturnal practices, which was also amplified by the fact that, of course, we are women, we're white, we're foreigners. So this is something that was also felt during the day, but also totally different during the nighttime. So this form of tiredness is inscribed in the film. For example, there's often a lack of focus, multiple images, and a kind of emphasis on blurring effects that speaks to our visual fatigue. So even though we filmed the film over multiple nights, our Guardians of the Night was later edited in one single night narrative, where the night allows for different sensibilities to emerge in a sensuous recurrent temporality. So the film structure emphasizes the role of the senses and specifically the sonic dimension, as I mentioned earlier. We eliminated all forms of conversation or narratives or like discussions between the characters to really engage with that sensorial dimension of the film. So rather than capturing the sound at a distance, we approach the nightscape in sound, following the concept of acoustemology developed by someone called Stephen Feld, who's very important in anthropology in terms of the thinking about sound and soundscape, even though he would be critical of that term. But in sound, so the nightscape in sound are conducting fieldwork in sound. The means that we adopt a listening practice practices that are attentive to the sounds that surround us in relation to the spaces, the people, and the events we encounter. So it is with this kind of relational and sensitive approach to ethnographic fieldwork in sound that we built the narrative Guardians of the Night, which became a film that is primarily sonic. So every time I tell people about the film, I tell them to listen to it first instead of watching it, or at least appreciating the film with headphones, because the soundtrack is really what leads the narrative of the film, which becomes very atmospheric rather than that developing a strong narrative based on images, although they're not excluded. So at the beginning of my my contribution, I talked about the premiere of our film in Guantanamo and how that started the a more of a phase of reflection, mainly written on our experience of the night in Guantanamo from an audiovisual and sensorial perspective. However, we recently had the opportunity of expanding on this reflection from a multimodal perspective. We've proposed a book project at Manchester University Press for a new series that they have called Anthropology, Creative Practice, and Ethnography. And our book project has been accepted. It's called Filming on the Dark Side, Nocturnal Ethnography in Cuba. So what we are doing in this project is that we are revisiting the footage of the film to propose a series of short clips showing what's not included in the film. And here we're playing with this idea of darkness, of what's not shown, what's not included, and also this idea of the night. And each clip is kind of the trigger to start each of the chapter of our book. And in this book project, we asked the questions, what was left intentionally or unintentionally on the side of the story in the film? What did we render visible or invisible of the night's own darkness and opaque characteristics? What are the sonic or stories can we tell with those footages and sounds that were not included in the film. Anyone involved in filmmaking know that a very little proportion of the footage makes it up to the final edit of a film. So there's so much that is left in the shadows. So we are now revisiting those footage to try to come up with new stories and new ways of engaging with the night. Just a short example, the scene of, there's a scene in the film of two women nail polish, so taking care of nails and polishing nails. The scene is very dramatic in a way. They don't talk to each other. It makes a very sad, even dark kind of relationship between the two. But this is totally not the experience that Eleonora and I had while we were shooting that scene, where the women were laughing and chatting, and the neighbors were playing domino. There was a lot of sound going on, a lot of activities. So we wanted to revisit that scene and show the proximity, the intimacy of these two women. And that gives us an opportunity to talk about gender and the night. So this is an example of how we are revisiting the film and the footage, and also how we're connecting this with the notion of the night. So this is, and now I'm passing it back to Eleonora for the conclusion.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, I'm gonna wrap it up quickly. So okay, so we wanted to make a link from the aesthetics and representation of the visualities to the technology. I'm gonna do this very quickly. We have just 3 examples of the visualities of the night. We want to start with a very mainstream example, which is the Netflix documentary TV series Night on Earth. If you haven't seen it, it's basically the Netflix crew going around the world and showing what we haven't been able to see for ages, because they got the money to do so. They have sharp to the point of technology. And there is a documentary, there is a behind the scene documentary about the series, which is really interesting because they discuss the technology that they use. They use moonlight sensitive cameras that show color thanks to the light of the moon. They use infrared cameras that actually uses light which is not visible to the human eye. They use thermal imaging, which records heat, and night vision goggles. So there are a few issues that arise from the film. The first one is the question of control, which has been discussed by many scholars in night studies, where darkness poses limitation to sight that historically humans have tried to attempt to overcome with technologies, from the electrification society to the John Lennon glasses. But it also poses the question of different regimes of visuality that actually coexist. So we have one that is based on light and sight, but there is also thermal imaging, which is not. It's based more on the detection of heat, more of a tactile side. And here I'm making a link also with what Lucia will present later. There are also 3 other questions that were important for us, is the fact that the TV series follows researchers around the globe, and there is a narrative about how the technology is helping those researchers. They've been conducting research for many years, and it's helping them to move forward in showing things that they have never been able to show because they didn't have the right technology to actually see it. Maybe they use GPS collars to see what the flamingos were doing at night, but we were not able to witness it. So there is a discourse, which is an old discourse in visual studies, on images as evidence for researchers in this case. But they also very often reflexively talk about their experience. So there is an embodied experience of doing research at night, which becomes prominent. And of course, the documentary reinforces the insistence on light and sight and its ontological privilege. By moving from this more mainstream example to artistic example, which are more marginal, but actually kind of challenge this vision. So we recently published an article for Visual Anthropology Review, and we're happy to see that we were not alone in this understanding of the night. So there is an article by an Italian artist, Alessio Mazzaro, called Crossing Common Darkness, where he explores darkness through an infrared camera. But what he does is that he reappropriates the infrared camera to disclose darkness rather than light, turning the ontological discourse on light. And very we're going to show another example. I think that the researcher that is doing this project is here. This is an example from researcher Chantal Meng. She's conducting a research project on night drawing, where she organizes monthly night drawing sessions with people in London and New York. And when we saw this image, this is one of the drawing that it was created by one of the participants. We were really struck by the resemblance between those two images. In a way, this it's basically a drawing made on black paper and white pen. And she makes the argument that it was actually easier for people to draw in using this technique. This is very similar to what could be a negative image, but also the infrared image that we showed before. So we think that this image tells a lot about, yes, viewing biases, but also the contamination of the aesthetics of the night. And we want to conclude with a few questions, with a few points that we are here to discuss. So the first one is that night allows for a diverse array of visualities, and we use the plural here because we moved from figuration in cinema concerned with representation in social practices to visual technologies and modes of perception. This plurality of visualities allows to go beyond the prominence of vision and sight and move to coexisting regimes of visuality, where the sonic and embodied tactile experience play a fundamental role in modes of perception. It allows us to rethink the ontological status of light, sight, and darkness, but also the role of technologies in shaping our imaginaries of the night, as with the last two examples. And finally, the role of the researcher. So how the embodied experience of the researchers in a reflexive autoethnographic way becomes a key element in rethinking also the visualities of the night. So we're going to end here. We'll leave you our email addresses as well if you want to email us with questions. And I'm going to
into a future moment, yet architectural design briefs rarely dwell on time or the changing rhythms of the day and night or of seasons. Nighttime is generally understood in the field of architecture to be synonymous with the highly specialized area of lighting design, which is used for aesthetic effects to enhance the perception of safety and security and to enhance marketability in the tourist economy. A key area of design for the night has been interior design. This specialization is characterized by bold designs for nightclubs, bars, and restaurants that operate at night. And I don't need to, of course, show any restaurant design images. A second significant area of practice that concerns the night is that of lighting modern and contemporary buildings. The advances in lighting technology transformed how modern buildings are designed at the beginning of the 20th century. These new buildings, shaped by the new technologies, especially lighting technologies, came to be designed to be lit like lanterns at night. Eric Mandelson's department stores in Germany in the 1920s pioneered this new architectural aesthetic of light. And as a result, lighting design emerged as a distinct profession, and earlier practitioners were drawn from within the ranks of architects such as Richard Kelly, who illuminated some of the 20th century's most iconic buildings, such as the Seagram building in New York, as seen to the right. A third area is tourism-oriented lighting for place marketing. Cities have lighting offices and they work with international lighting agencies. Such lighting design is used strategically to highlight certain urban areas, mostly empire or colonial era grand structures, and to make urban spaces look attractive and feel safe for moneyed classes, including tourists. And a recent prominent example is the Shanghai waterfront, which is part of a lighting project which includes 3 bridges and 77 grand buildings in the financial and tourist districts. Finally, a very popular area of practice of the past decade is 3D projection mapping on building surfaces. This type of practice is celebrated for liberating the moving image from the screen, fulfilling perhaps some of the promises of expanded cinema of the 1960s, while also animating architecture, which is static. All these four types of practice are based on a normative thinking about the night as a lack of daylight. What does it mean when we think of the night not as a lack, but as a distinct space? The interdisciplinary area of night studies encourages us to think past the night in terms of lighting design or lacking light, and to think about the residents, guests, and visitors of the night. As I will be discussing how the night offers a productive opening for architectural design, I want to come back to and briefly explain the notion of design involving a projection into a future moment. Anthony Dunn and Fiona Rabbit try in this crude diagram to visualize time versus imagination. The probable, they say, and here I quote, it's where most designers operate, unquote. Here, designers operate as service providers. The client has a brief, the architect does their best to translate that brief to space and form within given constraints of structures, building codes, budget, while observing changing expectations of taste. Speculative design, however, is in the realm of preferable. It's a future we would prefer. And the next couple of examples I will show you are definitely fictional but preferable futures. These examples are drawn from the student work of an undergraduate architectural design studio I offered in winter 2021. Architectural design studio is the core course of the professional education of architects, and it emulates the design component of what takes place in an architect's office. And in terms of education, the pedagogy, it takes over 2 or 3 full days in one-on-one conversations with the student, which we call a crit. I offered 2 versions of the studio, and the first one, just to kind of keep a record of it and to think more about what we did in the studio, I wrote a paper that just came out in the Journal of Architectural Education. And this paper is more about methodology or the process of design producing visuals. And I thank Eleonora and Will for giving me the opportunity to share and discuss work from the second version of that studio in this panel, which was which was a bit different in light of the pandemic years now that we had. So this particular panel invited presenters to explore the image making techniques and aesthetic principles we might find in visual representations of the night across various audiovisual media. My paper slightly diverges from this objective and discusses the affordances of the night for architectural design. The students, of course, or the works I will show you, of course, they produced visual representations of preferable futures considering the 24-hour city. The studio, when I designed it, I was meaning to kind of send students on a sensory ethnography of the night, and Guardians of the Night was one of the exemplary films that we had studied to do that, but of course a curfew set in. So it was interesting to run a studio on the night when we had the curfew. Okay, so the projects that evolved through intense discussions and individual student-led research can roughly be grouped around 3 questions. And we didn't necessarily begin with these questions, although there was strong kind of direction toward these questions. So the first is, who has the right to sleep outdoors at night? How can the city be inclusive to non-normative gender identities? And who has the right to be represented in public spaces? Next, I'm going to show you example projects for each, and I won't present the projects in full, and they are not necessarily the best projects. but I use them to reflect on these questions. So Montreal is known for its vibrant nightlife and skyline. Mylene Per and Rebecca Peralta studied the depictions of a homeless tent encampment in Montreal, which had recently been evicted. It is not homeless people that are problems, the two declared, and here I quote, rather the conditions and perceptions of homelessness that are problematic because they are stigmatized, deprecated, and willingly ignored by city dwellers, unquote. So a simple diagram here seen on the right that they produced focused on the literal act of looking down at the homeless. And the project began with a counter diagram of this relationship of visibility here. In their counter diagram, they imagine housed people looking up to the unhoused. And it's ironic that camping, which is a favorite national pastime and is promoted in the city by Parks Canada, is criminalized, of course, when the unhoused do it. Here on the left, we see the web announcement of a program, Spend the Night at the Canal, which takes place in the heart of Montreal, where citizens are invited to set up camp in the city as an experiential event. But when the unhoused actually set up tents, as seen on the right, the police is called in for forceful eviction. The homeless or unhoused are not property citizens, so they lack certain rights, setting up tent being one. Them setting up tent, in fact, unsettles the very foundation of a capitalist society. In Building Some Power, Thomas Marcus identifies three categories of people buildings serve to interface. And these categories can be extended to public space as positions of power. First are inhabitants, those who have rights of access to exclusion. Rights of access and exclusion. Second are visitors, those who are controlled. They have rights of access for specific purposes. For example, in many urban settings, women and minorities are to use public spaces during certain hours in certain decorum. And third are strangers or undesirables. They have no rights to access or exclusion. The homeless are perceived in this category. They're undesirables according to city administrations and other property people, as they disrupt the social contract between the state and its property-owning proper citizens. So the students decided to turn their attention to the ongoing housing protest and struggle. In Toronto, they mapped the various NGOs and city-run operations in the downtown core, providing limited care to the unhoused who had to shuttle back and forth between them. Their proposal was to build new housing for the unhoused, scandalously and consciously in Queen's Park, a prominent centrally located public space in the city. As here, this is an exploratory drawing on the right, and this is kind of their mapping here. So an understanding of shared ground, the project creates two datums, one for the general public who will continue to enjoy the park at level, and one for the unhoused to create a communal living form with shared facilities on a raised second level. By allocating the legitimacy of such a prime public property at night to the unhoused, the proposal turns the homeless from undesirable or strangers to the inhabitants of the park. A second question was how the city can be inclusive to non-normative gender identities. Studying drag culture in Chengdu and China, where they were based, Yuxan and Ija decided instead of the peripheral concentration of drag clubs in the city, that they want to see in the heart of the city's administrative and business center a new type of meeting space, which can become a nexus of connectivity for newly out or recently arrived non-binary, conforming individuals seeking to connect with other like-minded people. So this is the city's administrative business core, and there's a giant plaza with a car park underneath, and the plaza is marked by this binary yin-yang paving. So the proposal carves out a nightclub from within the car park underneath the central plaza of the city center, which, as I mentioned, is ironically landscaped with this giant binary yin-yang symbol. As the office workers in their imagination descend down to the metro and the car park, they have the chance to transform themselves and the space, and to transform the space of conformity. A third question that evolved out of the studio was who has the right to be represented in public spaces. The new forms of civil protest in the past decade in New York, Madrid, Istanbul, Paris, and most recently Black Lives Matter protests in many cities, they were marked by the festive use of night to gather in assemblies. And one of the most memorable sites of nighttime protest assembly during the 2020 BLM protests was activated by the projection of the image of George Floyd and other Black figures by artist Dustin Klein on the base of the statue of Confederate General Robert Lee on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. Q and Z, two students, examined the issue of representation in the context of Montreal's racist monuments. They explored how citizens inscribe themselves in urban space in Montreal and literally write and paint on surfaces. And much of this activity is clandestine and takes place at night. Entitled The Living Monuments, their proposal builds on existing practices in the city and creates a mobile pavilion that moves along to buttress any protest in the city. This is a new form of anti-monument that documents the public's voice and frames pictorially temporal events. So the mobile pavilion leaves this inscription. Again, it's a temporary inscription, but it the mobile pavilion moves, the inscription stays, and it's eventually washed away. To summarize, these investigations overall have led to a productive questioning of the notion of public good in design at the same time as they offered compelling counter images of public spaces, of how public spaces can be reconfigured to support the residents of the nighttime city. I want to thank I want to finish by thanking and crediting my teaching collaborators, Dr. Wilstrow and Dr. Alernathain. And the projects were presented in the form of short films, and they are streaming on these sites. There's an Instagram site for the new version of the studio, second final version of the studio, and a website for the first version of the studio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ipek. I'm always fascinated about your work with your students. We can talk about that later. We'll move to the last presentation, the last but not least. So we have the co-organizer of this panel, Wilstrow, Professor of Urban Media Studies at McGill University, Montreal. And she's going to talk about the visualities of the journalistic Nocturne.
Okay, well, thank you. You can hear me? Yeah. So yesterday I had cataract surgery on both of my eyes, and knowing that this was going to happen and not knowing what state I would be in, I pre-recorded my presentation. Now, as it turns out, my eyes are perfect. In fact, in the presentation, you'll see that I needed glasses to look at a computer screen, and now I no longer do. In any case, here, I'll share the screen now, and here is the presentation. Hello. The first thing I'll say is that my paper is not exactly what I said it would be in my abstract. I had big ambitions, including ranging across several countries, looking at variations of the journalistic nocturne in those countries, but I've reduced it and made it much more modest for reasons of time. So this slide is the banner headline for a column which appeared regularly in a periodical called the Interstate Tatler in 1928 and 1929. Harlem Nightlife was written at least partially by someone who called herself Lady Nicotine. We know from various sources that Lady Nicotine was actually Geraldine Dismond, an African-American woman who, I shall argue throughout this paper, was really the preeminent Black nightlife columnist in the United States for almost 40 years. The Interstate Tatler began publication in 1922 under the title The Hotel Tatler. And the Hotel Tatler was somewhere between a magazine and a newspaper. In its original form, it was aimed at Black Americans working in the hotel industry in the Northeast of the United States. In the mid-1920s, it changed its name briefly to the Tatler and eventually to the Interstate Tatler, which was its title until it ceased publication in 1932. Now, Harlem Nightlife was, as its title suggests, an early example of what by the end of the 1920s was known widely as the nightlife column in American urban journalism. It was a column which not only described events transpiring in the night, in this case in the night of Harlem, but which increasingly told the story of the author's travels through the night. The column observed nighttime culture from the perspective of someone deeply involved in it. Now, in this brief presentation, I really want to make three little, I think, modest points. The first is that the nightlife newspaper or magazine column, as it came to be known, the nightlife column, was a mutation of earlier forms of the urban chronicle. One of these forms was the society column, which reported on the meetings, the rituals, usually of social elites. The other was the theatrical column, which described, as the title suggests, as the name suggests, happenings in the world of theater and entertainment. Now, the nightlife column distinguished itself from these earlier forms, typically when it added to the description of social and theatrical happenings a narrativized account of the author's journey through the night. This need not be sort of a highly formulaic narrative. It could simply consist of descriptions of being in this place and that and then going somewhere else. The second point I want to make is that in the passage from these earlier forms into the nightlife column, the African-American press of the 1920s and 30s was perhaps the terrain, the site which saw the greatest experimentation with forms of writing about nightlife. And I've come to this argument recently, having looked at a quite enormous corpus of African-American publications from these decades. In the 1920s and 30s, the African-American press, which was dominated by weekly newspapers more so than by daily newspapers, was a press in which recurrent columns were perhaps the most common form of reporting. And the abundance of such columns encouraged modes of writing and narration which differentiated themselves from each other, but out of which writing about nightlife emerged as a particularly lively genre. And the third point I want to make, and this brings us at last to the question of visuality, which is the theme of this panel, is that the banner headlines for nightlife columns and later the kind of cover illustrations for magazines specializing in nightlife became a key site in which many of the cliches of what we can call a graphic nocturne are worked out. The nighttime cityscape with its illuminated buildings, the title whose typeface evokes urban festivity in its very communication of a sense of unease or mobility, the use of pointed signifiers of nightlife like the cocktail glass. All of these examples of what we might call minor forms of nocturnal visuality take shape during the 1920s and 1930s in the print culture of the United States, of what will quickly come to be known as the nightlife column. And by nightlife column, I mean a regular feature, daily or 2 or 3 times a week, authored by a single person, who in many cases, most cases, becomes a kind of celebrity devoted to recounting events transpiring within the nighttime culture of a particular city. Now, the night was hardly, in the 1920s, a new focus for magazines and newspapers. One line of development into the nightlife column is one that I've already mentioned, the society columns, like this in Town Topics, which reported on social functions involving social and political elites, although these were as likely to happen in the afternoon as during the evening. But to these we could add such transnational genres of journalism, or literature in fact, stories of movement through large cities at night. We could add the carnet, the chronicles reporting on the sociability of salons and cabarets, of which so much French scholarship has shown an interest in recent years. We could look at those forms of investigative journalism to which I've already referred, which ventured into places of nighttime social mixing in search of deprivation, in search of degradation and illegality. All of these have been the focus of rich scholarship. Nevertheless, despite this abundance of precursors to the nightlife column, people can claim to be able to identify quite specifically when the modern nightlife column emerges. This is traced typically to the early 1920s. It's associated with the figure of Walter Winchell, who was an unsuccessful vaudeville performer who began publishing columns of backstage gossip and lore, if you like, in the trade magazine Vaudeville News from 1920 to 1924. These columns, with their little bits of innuendo, their playful uses of language and so on, became unexpectedly popular. And in 1924, Winchell was hired by the New York Evening Graphic newspaper to write a column on nightlife, which was called Mainly About Main Streeters. Main Street referring to Broadway. And then in 1929, he moved to the Daily Mirror, where for the next several decades, he wrote a column called On Broadway. Now, Winchell's emergence as a nightlife columnist represents one of the two trajectories that I referred to a few minutes ago. The idea that the nightlife column emerges as a mutation of the theatrical column. Harriet Underwood's At the Cabarets column, for example, which appeared in the New York Tribune, is a good example of a theatrical column that doesn't become a nightlife column. It sort of ends, it ends with her death, but it ends at the moment in which the nightlife column is taking over from the specifically theatrical column. And it's when the sociability of bars and restaurants, of speakeasies, becomes more interesting than the specific professional worlds of the theater that the nightlife column finds its popularity. So that's one genealogy leading into the nightlife column, that of the theatrical backstage column. But the other is one that I referred to as well, which is that the idea of the nightlife column emerging out of the social column. And here I would suggest it is the African American press in which we find this mutation unfolding most strongly. And to capture this transition, let's look at an example of a social column from the African-American newspaper, the Chicago Defender, from 1927. Now, I'm not going to read this, but you can see it's an account of who was at a garden party, where they were from, and so on. And this is an installment of a column called Tidbits of New York Society, and it offers itself as a description of a social event, but reduces sociability to its purest informational forms, to the names and places of residence of those attending a garden party. And although by 1927 the column's title, Tidbits, might have promised gossip and innuendo, factuality here is unadorned by any commentary or indiscreet revelation. Like the club news of small-town newspapers, this paragraph seems to have little function beyond that of affirming the existence of community, cataloging civic life through the lists of people who participated in it. Now, we can compare this to what is more properly a nightlife column. This is Harlem Nightlife by Lady Nicotine, Geraldine Dismond, appearing in the Interstate Tatler in 1929. We walked around the corner to Pod's and Jerry's, what a mob, we got the last table, and so on. Here too, we have a list of names. Some of them are recognizable even in 2021. The white theatrical producer and librettist Oscar Hammerstein, for example, or Duke Ellington's wife Edna Ellington. Others, like Harriet Callaway, were relatively minor figures of African-American music and culture at the time in which the column was written and scarcely remembered today. But all of these names are absorbed within a narrative of sociability in motion, an account of the search for amusement in the late night city. And this makes the nightlife column distinct from the social column, and even though in their use of names and in their description of situations, they could be seen as performing similar functions. Now, the society column was a staple feature of African American newspapers. Historians of the Black press have tied the popularity or importance of the society column to the drive of these newspapers to produce a sense of respectable community in African American society. Here are the headings of some of the social columns appearing in only one issue of the Interstate Tatler in 1928. This idea of a roundup where from each of these key cities, Midwest through to the East Coast, we have descriptions of social events written typically by people living in those cities. And across the United States, African-American newspapers in Pittsburgh, in Portland, in Seattle, and other places would all have these kinds of roundups, these reports, if you like, on community in these different cities. We also here see Geraldine Dismond, who, when she wasn't Lady Nicotine, she was writing a very conventional social column, usually about New York City. By the 1930s, in the African-American press, the old-fashioned society column was losing some of its prominence, although it lingered for decades more. But to a certain extent, it was displaced by an ever-growing number of Harlem-based nightlife columns. Sometimes these were reflective essays more than anything else, but they were much of the time accounts of movement through the social worlds of nighttime Harlem. Now, in what remains of my time, I want to just look specifically at the visual tokens by which coverage of the urban night came to be marked. A simple example, let me find it, can be seen in this long-standing magazine for New York elites, Town Topics, where early text-only pages unadorned with illustration give way by 1929 to graphic forms like this one, in which we could see, I would argue, some version of the graphic Nocturne in the dark silhouette that evokes the night. From the 1920s into the 1940s, we see an explosion of periodicals claiming to cover the night. They're often simply entertainment guides, but the night, as much as the city, becomes the prism through which entertainment is evoked. And night is communicated in ways that are quite obvious, the electrically lit cityscape, or in more subtle ways through graphic features that convey a sense of unrest or festivity or effervescence. Nightlife newspaper columns, likewise, like this one, will proliferate, marked simply with the basic signifiers of the night in order partly to travel efficiently across the country in syndication form or to stand out within the newspapers in which they appeared. Now, I want to close with what I think is a growing or interesting possible avenue for future research, which is the increasingly networked and global character of the nightlife column. And partly I mean simply the ability of periodicals to pull in nightlife reports from around the world, much in the way the African-American press pulled in reports from cities around the United States. These are pages in the June 1955 issue of the Cuban magazine Show. And we have columns from around the Americas, Venezuela, New York, Miami. There are columns from Buenos Aires and other places in this issue as well. And each of these columns, in its title, and in the minor graphic adornments, of course, suggests something of the night. And by the 1950s, the capacity of magazines to feature columns from around the continent or the hemisphere will be held up as a sign of their omniscience. Now, Geraldine Dismond, who wrote for the Interstate Tatler and so many other African-American newspapers in the 20s and 30s, by the 1950s, she would be writing columns with a much more global perspective for the successful African-American magazine Jet. By this time, she had reverted to her birth name, Jerry Major, and like most gossip columnists of the post-war period, she no longer told the story of nights unfolding in a specific city in which she was involved. Rather, she offered the image of a global jet set, which she herself covered probably from her desk using information provided by press agents and news syndicates. And that's more or less what happened to the nightlife column in the years following World War II.